This wasn't a political clash, it was a financial decision disguised as one. What happened between Trump and Venezuela is usually told as ideology versus ideology, democracy versus dictatorship, pressure versus resistance, but that framing misses the real mechanism. Venezuela didn't lose power because it was challenged, it lost power because access was removed. And once access disappears, collapse doesn't need to be forced, it unfolds on its own. Venezuela didn't run out of oil, it ran out of permission. That single distinction explains almost everything that followed. Oil means nothing without buyers. Buyers mean nothing without banks. Banks mean nothing without compliance. And compliance doesn't answer to governments, it answers to systems that cannot afford risk. When those systems quietly step back, production turns into isolation overnight. By the time Trump's administration made Venezuela a headline, the structure was already fragile. What changed wasn't the intent, but the intensity. Restrictions multiplied, not as loud threats but as technical barriers. Legal language replaced military language. Treasury rules became more effective than sanctions ever announced on stage. To the public, it looked like punishment. To markets, it looked like a warning. This is how modern pressure works. You don't need to stop a country from selling. You just need to make everyone else afraid to buy. No announcement required, no deadline needed. Fear does the coordination for you. Shipping firms hesitated. Insurers pulled back. Banks delayed transfers. Partners stopped answering emails. Nothing was officially banned, it was simply no longer worth a risk. And when risk calculations change, ideology becomes irrelevant. This wasn't unique to Venezuela, it never is. Systems don't improvise, they repeat what already works. The US dollar didn't act as a weapon here, it acted as a gate. Most global trade passes through it, directly or indirectly. When access to that gate becomes conditional, alternatives exist only on paper. They're slower, more expensive, and easier to disrupt. The moment a country is pushed into those alternatives, leverage shifts. Venezuela adapted, not visibly, but quietly. New routes emerged. Informal networks replaced formal ones. Money kept moving, just outside the frame. And when money moves without visibility, accountability moves with it. This is the part rarely discussed. Economic pressure doesn't eliminate power, it redistributes it. Assets don't disappear, they change hands. Influence doesn't collapse, it concentrates. Trump became the face of this pressure, but the machinery never depended on him. Compliance departments don't vote. Legal frameworks don't campaign. They persist regardless of who speaks into the microphone. That's why the pressure outlived the headlines. What Venezuela represented wasn't a failure, it was a message. To markets, to governments, to anyone watching closely, access can be revoked. Participation can be conditional. And once the system decides you're no longer compatible, recovery becomes secondary. Because when financial systems break, they don't leave emptiness behind. They create opportunities, but not for those trapped inside them. And that's the part most stories leave unfinished. Once access was restricted, the story stopped being political and started becoming logistical. Venezuela didn't fall because it made the wrong speech. It fell because everyday systems stopped working at the same time. And when coordination collapses, outcomes accelerate. Oil shipments became unpredictable. Payments took longer, then failed entirely. Spare parts arrived late or not at all. Each delay looked small on its own. Together they formed a pattern that no press conference could fix. Production slowed, not because oil was gone, but because certainty was. Markets don't react to ideology, they react to friction. And Venezuela became friction-heavy overnight. This is where the invisible actors entered the scene. Compliance officers, risk committees, legal teams, people whose names never appear in headlines, but whose signatures decide whether a country can function inside the global economy. Their job isn't to punish, it's to avoid exposure. And once Venezuela crossed that threshold, avoidance became automatic. Fear scaled faster than any sanction list. Even companies not directly targeted pulled back, not because they were told to, but because uncertainty spreads quicker than regulation. One bank pauses a transfer, another follows. Soon the safest decision becomes inaction. And in a system built on movement, inaction is collapse. This pressure didn't need coordination, it needed alignment. And alignment happens when everyone reads the same risk. For the population, the effects felt immediate. Shortages weren't ideological, inflation wasn't symbolic. Currency instability didn't care about narratives. Everyday life became more expensive, more fragile, more unpredictable. And when that happens, attention shifts away from causes and towards survival. That shift matters. Because systems under stress don't collapse evenly, they fracture. And fractures create openings. As formal channels weakened, informal ones strengthened. Middlemen gained leverage. Brokers replaced institutions. Deals moved off record. Transparency faded. Control didn't disappear, it narrowed. Those closest to the flow gained influence, while those outside lost visibility. This wasn't chaos, it was a reorganization. From the outside it looked like decay. From inside the system it looked like adaptation. Power didn't vanish, it concentrated where oversight was weakest. And once that happens, reversing the process becomes harder than starting it. This is the uncomfortable trade-off of financial pressure. It claims to enforce order, but often breeds opacity. It claims to weaken regimes, what frequently strengthens the actors who thrive without rules. And the longer it lasts, the deeper these structures root themselves. Trump's administration emphasized speed and visibility, announcements, deadlines, statements, but systems respond to continuity, not volume. And continuity came from institutions that never needed to speak publicly. The pressure didn't spike, it settled. That's why lifting sanctions later doesn't undo the damage. Trust doesn't return on command. Roots don't reopen instantly. Relationships don't reset because policy shifts. Once a system adapts to exclusion, inclusion becomes risky, and this is where the long-term cost appears. Venezuela didn't just lose revenue, it lost predictability, and predictability is the real currency of global systems. Without it, investment avoids you, insurance prices rise, partnerships evaporate. Even when doors reopen, hesitation remains. This is how pressure outlives politics. What began as a response became a condition. And conditions don't need justification to continue. They only need inertia. At this point, the question was no longer whether Venezuela would change. It was who would be positioned when the system reshaped itself around the damage. Because systems rarely rebuild for those they break. As pressure settled into permanence, the narrative around Venezuela shifted. It was no longer framed as a crisis to be solved, but as a reality to be managed. And that shift is critical, because systems behave very differently once a problem is no longer temporary. Temporary problems invite solutions. Permanent ones invite exploitation. By this stage, new actors had already positioned themselves. Not governments, not diplomats, but intermediaries. Traders willing to operate in gray zones. Financial structures designed to move quietly. Partnerships built not on stability, but on discretion. These weren't alternatives, they were replacements. And replacements change ownership. Oil still moved, but not openly. Deals happened, but not transparently. Revenue arrived, but not cleanly. Each layer added cost, and each cost removed accountability. What remained was a narrower circle of beneficiaries operating closer to the flow than before. This is where the idea of pressure becomes misleading, because pressure implies resistance. What actually happens is adaptation. Systems don't break when stressed, they reorganize, and reorganization rewards those who can tolerate opacity. The public story focused on leadership, on Maduro, on Trump, on elections, speeches, legitimacy. But the system had already moved past personalities. It was optimizing for survival, not optics. And survival systems don't care who they empower. This is the silent consequence rarely discussed. Financial isolation doesn't create reformers, it creates specialists. People who know how to move value without visibility. People who benefit from instability because stability would expose them. Once these structures form, they don't dissolve easily, they become embedded. They build their own incentives. And over time, they start resisting the very transparency that pressure was supposed to enforce. This is why recovery is never clean. Even if restrictions ease, the parallel systems remain. They've proven useful, they've created wealth, and they've reshaped control. Returning to openness would mean giving that up. Few actors do so voluntarily. From the outside, it looks like stagnation. From within, it's equilibrium. Trump's strategy emphasized leverage, maximum pressure. The assumption was that enough strain would force change. But leverage only works if the system has somewhere to move. When formal channels close completely, informal ones don't disappear, they dominate. At that point, pressure stops producing outcomes and starts producing permanence. This dynamic isn't unique to Venezuela, it's structural. The same mechanisms appear wherever access is restricted without pathways back in. Over time, the goal shifts from reintegration to survival, and survival reshapes priorities. The irony is that the system still functions. Oil flows, money moves, goods circulate, but the benefits no longer align with the original structure. They pool around those best positioned to operate in ambiguity. This is where the moral clarity fades. Sanctions are presented as tools of accountability, but accountability requires visibility, and visibility was one of the first casualties. The more pressure increased, the less transparent the system became. What remained was control, but not necessarily in the hands intended. By the time political narratives caught up, the economic reality had already hardened. New norms formed. New dependencies emerged, and reversing them would require dismantling structures that now serve powerful interests. At this stage, the question was no longer about Venezuela's leadership. It was about whether the system that replaced the old one would ever allow itself to be undone. Because systems built in the dark rarely choose the light again. By the time the pressure became normal, the damage was no longer visible. And invisible damage is the hardest to reverse. Venezuela wasn't just operating outside the system anymore. It had been replaced by a version of the system that no longer needed permission. This is where most analyses stop. They measure success by collapse, avoided, or regime change delayed. But that misses the deeper shift. The system didn't fail, it adapted, and adaptation always leaves a new order behind. That new order didn't belong to the state. It didn't belong to the market either. It belonged to those who learned how to function without transparency, without guarantees, without accountability. Power moved closer to the flow and further from oversight. And once that happens, reform becomes theoretical. Reintegration is often presented as a switch. Lift restrictions, restore access, normalize trade. But systems don't reset like that. Trust doesn't return because policy changes. Capital doesn't forget friction. Institutions remember risk far longer than governments remember strategy. Even if every barrier disappeared tomorrow, the system wouldn't rush back in. It would hesitate, it would test, it would wait. And during that waiting period, the parallel structures would continue operating because they already worked. This is the hidden cost of financial warfare. It doesn't end when pressure stops. It ends when incentives change. And incentives rarely change in favor of transparency once opacity has proven profitable. Trump's approach didn't invent this dynamic, it accelerated it. Maximum pressure didn't just test Venezuela's resilience, it tested the limits of the system itself. And the system responded the only way it knows how, by optimizing. Optimizing doesn't mean stabilizing, it means surviving. What remains today isn't simply a weakened country, it's a transformed one. The old channels no longer define control, the new ones don't announce themselves, and that makes future outcomes harder to predict, not easier. This is the paradox. Pressure was meant to force alignment. Instead, it produced divergence. The more exclusion became permanent, the more independence from visibility became valuable, and value attracts power. From a distance, the story looks unresolved. No clear victory, no clean defeat. But underneath, something far more permanent took shape. A system that learned how to function without access doesn't rush to rejoin the one that excluded it. And that lesson didn't go unnoticed. Other governments watched, markets watched, institutions watched. Not the speeches, the mechanics. They saw how access could be removed without force, how pressure could be applied without accountability, and how adaptation could quietly undo the original intent. This is why the story matters beyond Venezuela, because it wasn't about one country. It was about a method, a demonstration of how modern power operates when it doesn't want to look like power. No tanks, no invasions, just compliance, risk, and silence. And once those tools are normalized, they don't stay isolated to one case, they become precedent. The question now isn't whether Venezuela will recover, it's whether systems designed to operate without visibility will ever choose to give it back, because when power learns, it can move quietly, it rarely returns to making noise. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Capital Stories, where power moves quietly, and money tells the real story.